Hello all, we are again back with the Vikings and another reason for the beginning of the Viking Age. Today we'll be looking at some of the internal and external political factors that helped lead to the age. We'll go into how the chieftain warrior system worked, and how the previous population expansion and farm limitations helped to push the political atmosphere. We'll also discuss the Frankish Empire on the mainland, and how the effects of its weakening towards the end of Charlemagne's reign helped to entice the Viking raids. And finally, I'll share some quick thoughts on the upcoming Assassin's Creed VALHALLA game. But before we begin, please consider subscribing to help grow the channel, and click the bell button to be notified for more history and game videos. Also, check out my Patreon page and join others to help support more history videos. This video is a big one, so strap yourself into your longship and let's get rowing. Well, a land full of poor peasants with smaller groups of people having power over them sounds extremely close to feudalism. But Scandinavia around the time of the Viking Age wasn't quite at that stage. Not to say that there weren't kings in Scandinavian lands. There were a few listed in Denmark and Sweden, and a few even smaller ones in Norway. But from what we can tell, they were nowhere near the level of what we would traditionally think of as a king. When we think of kings, we think of a very strict order to society. Kings lend out land to lords and knights, and even some of those lords end up owning the land, and they can give it out to their knights, and so on and so forth. Religious entities also owned land, and the poor peasants had to support all these higher classes, who in turn must protect them whenever enemy armies came rolling through. But in Scandinavia around the 700s CE, while they did have a similar system, it was much smaller, and with a few quirks. Chieftains controlled lands as well. And with these land holdings, they had farmers till the soil and pay part of their crops as taxes. Fair enough. And some kings arose now and then who took control of several clans and villages, but they were always subject to debate in the present day on how much real power they had and what was just myth passed down over the centuries. Alright, you might say, they're just mini kings, that's not so different. But instead of having a leadership position based on hereditary or religious rights, a chieftain's power was subject to generosity, food, and reputation. We might see some of this in the game. At the time, everyone in the world raided their neighbors every once in a while, and Scandinavians were no different. But colder weather up north meant shorter growing seasons, and that meant that sometimes there wasn't enough food for everyone. That meant to get enough, you just may need to raid that village you didn't like in the first place. Maybe they sold you that old cow that didn't produce milk, and you just had it out for them ever since. Why don't they just fish and not fight, you might ask? Well, they fished too. But again, if everyone else was doing the same thing and competing for the same schools of fish and etc., you just might run out after a few seasons. You see, a growing problem, if you remember from the last episode, was that there was a slight population increase. That of course means that there's more mouths to feed. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist to realize where that might lead to. So increasingly, towards the end of the 8th century, more people, with not always having enough food for them, meant that violence was going to ramp up more than usual. But what was the usual? Food for eating was only part of the reason. Food also worked for political prestige as well, if you were a chieftain who could show that you provided sustenance for your people. But first, you most likely needed to take it away from others who needed it just as bad. To do this, a chieftain needed an army. A leader was only as strong as their warriors, and how many warriors they had at their disposal. While you could call on the farmers of your lands to military service as part of their agreement to live on your land, which leaders did, don't get me wrong, you needed some more battle-hardened and experienced fighters. Good fighters, popularly referred to in literature sometimes as heroes, also had reputations and could acquire a good following in their own right, but if they didn't own any land, they could travel to a chieftain and pledge service to them as long as the chieftain upheld certain standards. Usually those standards were food and privileges, as well as victory and part of the spoils of battle. A famous and generous chieftain could draw many warriors to his hall. Warriors with great reputations could earn and bargain for more goods and wealth. So a good reputation went a long way for both parties. A good fighter or two on your side could help inspire your army and help lead them to victory. It's at this point that we should remember that a majority of military engagements of the time period were not thousands upon thousands of soldiers, many raids and battles just had a few hundred on each side, so several good warriors and their followers could change the tide of battle in your favor. On the other hand, you needed to meet their stipulations. If you proved to be a coward or an incompetent leader, those warriors could leave and go off to a rival chieftain. This is in stark difference to later feudal systems, where if loyalty was pledged to a king, it would be very dishonorable to leave their lordship without dire cause, even if they weren't a good king. Here, it sounds like a code of mutual benefits. If one side didn't uphold their duties, the other had the right to leave, without any dishonor to their rep. Sounds like a fair trade, and perhaps I'll make a later video on some of the cultural traditions that the Viking era has left for the world. But the better your reputation as a brave and generous leader, the more professional warriors you'd attract. So back to food. People need to eat, along with furthering their reputations and resources to acquire more warriors and power. Local chiefdoms fought each other. Some crushed others, only to get obliterated themselves later the next season. This back and forth violence understandably put a strain on already scant resources, and you needed those resources to justify your leadership. As temperatures began to warm and village populations grew, raiding spread. Food and livestock were changing hands frequently, and sometimes being destroyed in the pandemonium of war. Some chieftains began to increasingly look for perhaps an easier way to acquire goods, or at least a place that would have enough goods to make raiding worthwhile. In this endeavor, some began to look across the ocean to other lands. If you could raid somewhere else that had resources and bring them back, you could use that wealth to bargain for more power back home, while your rivals squabble over their neighbors' scraps. But while the idea of raiding other lands and procuring goods for trade must have been there for a long time before the Viking Age, it wasn't always feasible. Raiding works best when your target doesn't have the ability to defend themselves to a great extent. Yes, Vikings were great warriors, but they didn't really want to fight trained armies and soldiers. Organized armies of Romans, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Huns, and others did not present the softest of targets if you were looking to raid a kingdom or empire. You wanted to be able to live and spend the wealth that you just took. Now some might argue, well, what about Valhalla? Wouldn't Vikings not care who they fought or worry about death? And so I'm going to break off for about 2 minutes and talk to you about it. The concept of Valhalla as a sort of heaven is off context. It was more of a training camp for the souls of brave, dead heroes who were selected by Odin. So just being a warrior in and of itself was not an actual guarantee that you're getting in. Also, that would mean we would have to believe that every Viking warrior was some religious fanatic. And in terms of just being human, most were probably not. Now, I'm not saying religious beliefs were not important to people's actions in history, especially in times of dire need such as battle. But almost always, most people, regardless of belief, usually don't want to die for any reason, even if it did come with benefits. The Viking raiders were human just like anyone else in history, with most likely varying degrees of how religious they were and how devout they were to try to die in battle. Just remember, those religious benefits of death act more like a safety net, in case you were to die, than an actual conscious drive to actively seek it out. So a soft target that wasn't going to fight back was way better to test the waters than taking on a hard target. Even better if they were rich in goods. Towards the end of the 8th century, there was something in the air that made these foreign lands more enticing than ever before. Let's leave Scandinavia for a bit and look at the rest of Eurasia. In the west, the Carolingian Empire that covered most of today's France and parts of Germany, Italy, and Spain was a major power to contend with. For decades, they had wiped out the competition, and within the latter half of the 8th century, put on the finishing touches of the empire. Along the British Isles, after the Romans, there were many independent kingdoms as well as the Saxon entities that had laid claim to the domain. Eastward, the Slavs had grown to become the dominant ethnic group in the lands that would later comprise such modern states as Russia and Ukraine today. But near the dawn of the 9th century, things began to change. Towards the end of Charlemagne's reign, the emperor was getting weaker in health and the empire was divided among his sons. While this would result in death and civil war later for the empire, neighboring rivals and opportunists at the moment were beginning to see the cracks. In the British Isles, the problem was while the Saxons during the 8th century were trying to consolidate power, competition between the different Saxon kingdoms, political rivalry, and chaos due to military actions from Picts, Irish, and the original indigenous Britons, who would later become known as Welsh, made the Isles increasingly fractured. It was even more fractured than the mainland at this point, which may have led some Viking chieftains to consider it as a good place to strike for easy goods with the least possible chance of getting killed. Looking east, while some conquest would be necessary, the most attractive part were the many major rivers that could be used to access the rich trading markets of the Black and Caspian Seas. Taking valuables to those areas could vastly increase one's power back home, possibly even more so than Western targets. All one needed was access and goods to trade. This led to even higher incentives to go on raids. But what about the Slavs? Well, the settlement and villages in the area were not part of one large solid kingdom. Most people shared a culture and heritage, but not much else. Like Greek city-states, these settlements were largely autonomous, and by reports from Patrikios in the 6th century, some were even extremely democratic with self-rule without a singular chieftain or king. This, of course, made them fractured, which again meant that presenting a unified front to the invaders was going to be very difficult. Some groups might try to fight the invaders, while others would ally with them. This meant that they did not pose as threatening an outlook as the Frankish Empire to the west and south presented. These reasons, both internal and external, encouraged potential Viking leaders to believe that they could possibly gain wealth and power from going abroad. Well, according to a few news articles and those who are savvy enough to pause the trailer where the king places his seal on a document and it says Alfred, or whom we call today Alfred. If there was only one famous king during the Viking Age in the British Isles, that would be Alfred the Great. Alfred tried to defend and expand the Saxon kingdoms, or what was left of them, during his reign from 871 to 886 CE. So this is well into the Viking Age, nearly 100 years. Ubisoft also mentioned that the player would travel between Norway and England. This raises some questions about the differences between Vikings, which I'll cover in another video, but I also suspect that we'll be traveling somewhere else in the game that they're not mentioning. We saw in the game trailer people settling somewhere, and the battles with the Saxons. Thing is, settling Iceland also took place during the same time as Alfred the Great. Developers are saying that there are more surprises that they aren't getting into, but I think at some point we're going to Iceland. Perhaps the trailer shows our settlement in Iceland rather than Danelaw, England. And it's not the first time we had to build up a base in an Assassin's Creed game, with ships and homesteads, etc. But this one seems much larger in context. Hopefully it's not just another thing where after it gets built up, it just becomes boring and useless. Or maybe it's just too far for regular gameplay, but we'll do something special there, like we did with Principe in Black Flag. While I haven't been 100% in my predictions for past games, I have been pretty close in many of them. And more people would know that if I just had a larger following. And if there was a news article that I missed at the time of recording this that talks about the subject, go ahead and share it. But that's the episode for today, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please click the like button to help bring this video to new viewers, and subscribe for more future content on Vikings and other history videos. Also, consider supporting the channel on Patreon and get your name in the end credits, or by using the link provided for downloading the free web browser, Brave, for more privacy on your internet. Lastly, I would like to thank all my subscribers for continuing to support the channel, and thank you to those who are here for the first time. I'm Eric, the LonePineWolfman, and remember gamers, never stop learning.